Hello. Little announcement first. The Dirt Unit can now be found on all the podcast streams. So Spotify, Podcast Addict, Google Podcasts, whatever. You can find us there. Get on it and you can listen wherever you are. Those listening to the podcast, if you are, just know that this is a video podcast. So there's going to be a lot of images on the screen while I'm talking that you won't be able to see. It shouldn't make a difference, but if you did want to check it out, just go to YouTube. It's BIAS News AU at YouTube. You can find us there. Whew. We've got a heavy one today. I've had to split this episode into two because it went for 2 hours. So this is the first half. So what we've been doing is we're on this quest to find the different arms of the Liberal Party's campaigning machine. So we've looked at Crosby Textor, their company they used to campaign, former members of the Liberal Party that branched out and started their own lobbying and elections company. We've looked at them, we've looked at what they do. We found that Scott Morrison's Chief of Staff and the Liberal Party's actual campaign manager are both straight from Crosby Textor. We've learned that in 2018, Crosby Textor became the CT Group and they started contracting out different aspects of their campaign to different companies. So we're trying to figure out what those companies might be and how they work, or at least what they do. We found one of them. It's Topham Guerin, and they're a meme farm. So maybe have a look at what they've used as inspiration so we can maybe get an idea of where to look over here. We're in the process of looking over to America. So we finished the last episode with looking at the Koch brothers' data software company called i360. Then we learned that the Liberals have a data software of their own called Feedback, by a company called Parakelia, which is owned by the Liberal Party. And then we learned that in 2018, the Victorian Liberals actually joined Feedback up with the i360 database. So with this episode, we're going to be digging around a little deeper on the extended network of right-wing influence in America that's been coined the Kochtopus. This episode will be, the idea of it is to be used as a reference for the future. So I'm basically going to lay out a lot of information out here, but then I'm going to be referring back to it as we go along in this thing. So it's all here, in one spot. So that if anyone's questioning things I'm saying or whatever, I can sort of say, have a listen to this. You with me? I'm going to start by reading a outtake from an article about the Koch brothers that was written in the Huffington Post. In the Middle Ages, France had the three estates: aristocrats, clerics, and commoners. Just prior to the French Revolution, the four estates of the realm became the aristocracy, the clerics, the middle class, and the peasants. After the Revolution, the press came to be called the Fourth Estate because the peasants were simply ignored or reblended into commoners along with the merchants. And the aristocrats bought printing presses and started the propaganda business, which certainly were important determinants of the government and so had to be granted their own estate, the Fourth Estate. Kochville, the Libertarian movement, is merely the latest embodiment of that type of class-driven polity. But it cloaks itself in the free market, as if the freedom that they seek is really for any social class or estate other than their own. The aristocracy, whom they think of as simply the job creators, while holding workers in and treating them with contempt as being merely replaceable, if not expendable. Economic hierarchy is their only morality, because they're at the top of it. So I've done this little graphic up here. And these are the different arms of the Kochtopus. So you've got the money men, of which they are 2 of them. There's a lot of other. And by money men, I mean like money people. Just sounds better because both words start with M. Through the money men that fund these things, you've got the think tanks and the academics. And the academics supply the evidence needed for the think tanks to form their policies. And then the think tanks build support for those policies through the next arm, which is the media. And this is like your traditional media, like Fox News. And that then flows down to like their alt media network, which flows on through their AstroTurf network, a giant network of Facebook groups and sock puppet accounts and Twitter pages and all this stuff, which builds what ends up seeming like a lot more support than actually there is in reality. But it builds the perception of this widespread support that the politicians that are either part of or in the pockets of these think tanks can then use to get the legislation through. Another arm of the Kochtopus is the judiciary. You know, social issues, more like non-policy related type, you know, far right things, like abortion and all that kind of stuff. They got private militia. Not joking when I say these guys want to privatize everything. And then we've got the data. And all this network sort of rose to prominence in the Reagan era, and then have kind of ticked away. And then Trump sort of became their next Reagan. It started before Reagan. So in 1977, Charles Koch started the Cato Institute. And then the next year they started what became the Mercatus Center, which is part of George Mason University. So this was sort of like an early primitive form of like blurring the line between think tanks and academia. So 6 years later, in 1984, David Koch, wrong pronunciation. David Koch then started Citizens for a Sound Economy. So I'll just read a little bit out of an article in The New Yorker from 2010. The Koch brothers, after helping to create Cato and Mercatus, concluded that think tanks alone were not enough to affect change. They needed a mechanism to deliver those ideas to the street and to attract the public's support. So in 1984, David Koch created yet another organization. This group, Citizens for a Sound Economy, seemed like a grassroots movement, but according to the Center for Public Integrity, it was sponsored principally by the Kochs, who provided $7.9 million between 1986 and 1993. Its mission was to take these heavy ideas and translate them for mass America. And that ticked away all through the 90s. And this is behind, you know, all the deregulation of the 90s and that kind of stuff. But I guess, was it year 2000, where Al Gore lost the election and then ended up releasing that documentary about global warming? I guess they started feeling the heat. Actual genuine grassroots groundswell for more regulation when it comes to the environment. And I guess you can sort of see here the classic move, which we spoke about last time, the old switch throw, which is like pointing out other people for doing what they're doing, so that when people figure out that that's what they're doing, it just sounds like a conspiracy theory. So you can sort of see that forming when you think all the accusations of Al Gore, of it being some kind of Democrat plot to force regulation on the environment and, I don't know, become communists or whatever. So in 2004, it split. This is Citizens for a Sound Economy, split into 2 different groups: Freedom Works and Americans for Prosperity.
Conservative group Americans for Prosperity brought its regulation reality tour to Grand Junction. Organizers told the crowd that the EPA plan would hurt businesses and drive up costs for consumers.
I'll just read this thing about Americans for Prosperity from a website called govreform.net. So according to its website, our mission is to mobilize citizens and advocate for policies that cut red tape and increase opportunity, put the brakes on government overspending, and get the economy working hard for hard workers, not special interests. Let's examine their mission statement. Advocate for policies that cut red tape. AFP and the Koch brothers are the leading advocates in reducing the Environmental Protection Agency's power and their regulations. The Koch brothers are currently under investigation in Florida for dumping tons of toxic waste into the St. Johns River every day. In the year 2000, the EPA fined the Koch brothers $30 million for its role in 300 oil spills, and it was fined $20 million for benzene emissions in Texas. Not very hard to guess the Koch's motivation here, and the push to lower taxes is focused on lowering taxes on corporations and the rich, not on everyone else. The next bit. Putting the brakes on government spending. Besides advocating the elimination of the EPA and other government regulatory agencies, the AFP and the Koch brothers want to eliminate or privatize all social programs. As for mobilizing citizens, AFP's answer is the Tea Party. The Koch brothers and Big Tobacco created the Tea Party, and AFP's president is Tim Phillips, a Republican campaign strategist that was an early Tea Party organizer. AFP gets its data mostly from two other Koch-funded think tanks, the Koch Institute and the Heritage Foundation. AFP frequently provides a platform for climate contrarian statements such as, "How much information refutes carbon dioxide caused global warming? Let me count the ways." AFP's messages are in sync with those of other groups funded by the Kochs and their other special interest groups that work against progressive initiatives and protections for workers and the environment. And then the other group is Freedom Works. So this is Freedom Works talking about Freedom Works. This is from their 2020-21 annual report. Freedom Works exists to build, educate, and mobilize the largest network of activists advocating the principles of smaller government, lower taxes, free market, personal liberty, and the rule of law. With a grassroots army of volunteers standing behind its name, Freedom Works is a force multiplier, mobilizing an activist community to support constitutionally limited government, free markets, and personal freedom. As a non-profit organization, Freedom Works focuses primarily on mobilizing the grassroots to help pass or defeat legislation at the state and federal level and sounding the alarm about politicians' legislative records. In 2020, Freedom Works certainly had its hands full with heated presidential election year battles, crucial confirmation fights, and COVID-19 lockdowns, making Freedom Works' focus on online mobilization more critical than ever. So these places run like a vast network of like pages and accounts on all the social media platforms to distribute their propaganda. But where all this comes to fruition and meets all the other sort of big players in the right-wing, behind-the-scene billionaires space is the Heritage Foundation. This is from SourceWatch. Founded in 1973, the Heritage Foundation is a right-wing think tank. Its stated mission is to formulate and promote public policies based on the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense. It's widely considered one of the most influential public policy research institutes. The foundation wields considerable influence in Washington, D.C. and enjoyed particular prominence during the Reagan administration. So this is an article from 1996 talking about the Heritage Foundation. Based in a spacious brick building a few blocks from the Capitol, the Heritage Foundation is running the most effective media operation in American politics. Heritage has succeeded with a savvy strategy. Raise a lot of money from rich people with a right-wing agenda, hire writers, commentators, and out-of-office politicians who share that agenda and call them fellows, political analysts, and distinguished scholars. And then, always, back them up with a public relations juggernaut that's second to none. By now, the Heritage Foundation is the most widely cited think tank in the United States, appearing frequently on television and radio. Heritage personnel also generate a non-stop flow of op-ed pieces for newspapers, At the same time, Heritage produces a blizzard of press releases, position papers, news conferences, and seminars aired on C-SPAN. For good measure, Heritage headquarters has a radio station that serves as a convenient broadcast facility for talk show hosts from around the country who want to beam their live programs home from Washington. In the nation's capital, many outfits rake in big bucks while trying to affect US government policies. The Heritage Foundation is notable for the shrewd way it spends money, lavishing much of its budget on an ongoing PR campaign that targets news media across the United States. 42% of the Heritage's budget goes to some form of publicity, described as media and government relations or educational programs. Basically, the Heritage Foundation just want to privatize everything. These guys are behind the anti-renewable energy legislation, getting rid of the minimum wage, healthcare, workers' rights, the EPA, etc. To give you an idea of the power of the Heritage Foundation, this is an article from Mother Jones from, I think it was last week or the week before. Dark Money Group brags about writing GOP voter suppression bills across the country. Republican legislators claim that they're tightening up election procedures to address unfounded concerns about fraud in the 2020 election. But what's really behind this effort is a group of conservative Washington insiders who have been pushing these same kind of voting restrictions for decades, with the explicit aim of helping Republicans win elections.
The left is using this basically as psychological warfare.
Switch throw. The difference now is that Trump's baseless claims about 2020 have given them the ammunition to get the bills passed, and the conservative movement, led by Heritage, is making an unprecedented investment to get them over the finishing line. We're working with these state legislators to make sure that they have all of the information they need to draft the bills, Anderson told the Heritage Foundation donors. In addition to drafting the bills in some cases, we've also hired state lobbyists to make sure that in these targeted states we're meeting with the right people. In some cases, we actually draft the bills for them, or we have a sentinel on our behalf give them the model legislation so that it has a grassroots from the bottom up type of vibe. To create this echo chamber, as Anderson put it, Heritage is spending $24 million over 2 years in 8 battleground states to pass and defend restrictive voting legislation.
Massive right-wing campaign to suppress voting rights in key battleground states like Georgia, Arizona, Florida, and Iowa just this year.
So it's worth noting that Trump had about 60-odd people from the Heritage Foundation in his administration. These groups achieve their legislation through what's called the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is another Koch-funded organization. So this and the Heritage Foundation is where the other money people and the other various foundations and interests all intersect. There's a lot. I'm not going to go into all of them. I'm just going to go into the ones that are relevant to the story I'm telling here. But the big guys, like the Republican mega donors, Charles Koch, David Koch, they just get lumped into being the same person. Well, David Koch died in 2019, so it's just Charles Koch now. Sheldon Adelson's another one. He also died a few months ago. He was a casino billionaire from Atlanta. He was another mega donor. And then the fourth one, he's a man by the name of Robert Mercer, who's a hedge fund billionaire. And then, as well as them, I wouldn't say under them, I'd say as well as them, you've got the Wilkes brothers, who are the fundamentalist Christian fracking dynasty. Nina Rosenwald, who is the Sears heiress. She chairs something called the Gatestone Institute. Rosenwald's donations to pro-Israel organizations have earned her a place of considerable influence in the pro-Israel firmament. She served on the board of directors of many pro-Israel organizations, including Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and the Hudson Institute. I'm not going to go into the Hudson Institute in too much detail today, but they're kind of like a foreign policy focused type thing. Interestingly, the Hudson Institute was actually instrumental in the push of the weapons of mass destruction narrative in Iraq. And it seems to recently have sort of infiltrated the online podcast sort of space, which is a worry. It's an interesting group, but it's not really relevant to today, so we'll continue. Rosenwald was also the vice president of the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. In 2003, she was a recipient of the Louis Brandeis Award given by the Zionist Organization of America for her pro-Israel advocacy. She also serves on the boards of the Middle East Forum, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, and the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, the Institute for National Security Studies, Israel, and the American Friends of the Open University of Israel, as well as, curiously, some organization called Human Rights in China. This is what Wikipedia has to say about human rights in China. Human Rights in China has published thematic reports and briefings, issues backgrounders, and short reports on topics involving ethnic minorities, women and children, control of the media, labor rights and state secrets, legal reform, and social unrest. Human Rights in China also issues long reports on human rights issues and circulates them to multilateral bodies, media, policymakers, governments, and non-government organizations. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. This is basically the think tank that dictates America's foreign policy. WikiLeaks released an image of the media arm of the Council on Foreign Relations, which I'll place up while I read a bit of their entry on SourceWatch. The Council on Foreign Relations, founded in 1921, is a United States not-profit think tank specializing in US foreign policy and international affairs. It's headquartered in New York with additional office in Washington, D.C. Its membership has included senior politicians, more than a dozen secretaries of state, CIA directors, bankers, lawyers, professors, and senior media figures. CFR meetings convene government officials, global business leaders, and prominent members of the intelligence and foreign policy community to discuss international issues. They publish a bi-monthly journal, Foreign Affairs, since 1922, and it runs the David Rockefeller Studies Program, which influences foreign policy by making recommendations to the presidential administration and diplomatic community, testifying before Congress, interacting with the media, and publishing on foreign policy issues. And you'll notice there that they run a pretty tight ship. You'll also notice that there's a certain former Australian on that Council of Foreign Relations for America. If that ain't foreign interference, I don't know what is. So after Rosenwald, you've got Rebecca Mercer. So she's the daughter of Robert Mercer. But she runs the Mercer family operation. So she sits on the board of the Heritage Foundation. By all accounts, Robert Mercer is not a guy that likes to speak. Rebecca Mercer does all the everything. Then you got the DeVos family. Betsy DeVos, who ended up becoming Trump's education secretary. And then Eric Prince, who runs the Blackwater USA. This is the private militia.
Blackwater will always be linked to the first decade of the so-called War on Terror. And it should, because it made billions of dollars off it. Blackwater was essentially a private army, a company founded by a right-wing former Navy SEAL Eric Prince, who made a lot of money providing mercenaries to the US government. The invasion of Iraq was a gravy train for Blackwater. The State Department contracted it to guard American officials around Iraq, but soon allegations began surfacing that put the company in the spotlight. These included drunken behavior, drug use, overbilling the State Department, that means you taxpayer, smuggling weapons, and harming civilians. When the State Department sent an official to Baghdad to investigate these allegations, a Blackwater manager threatened to kill him. So, what did the US Embassy there do? It told the investigator to leave Iraq immediately because he was disturbing Blackwater's operations. A few weeks later, Blackwater guards killed 17 civilians at Baghdad's Nisr Square. It was a turning point for both Blackwater and the US war in Iraq. The Iraqi government dropped the immunity contractors had from Iraqi courts and made those companies apply for a license to work in Iraq, but wouldn't give one to Blackwater. In 2009, the State Department said it wouldn't renew Blackwater's contract in Iraq. The name was becoming toxic. so the company changed it to Z Services. But the bad publicity continued. In 2010, 5 former executives were charged with illegally hiding weapons at the company's headquarters in North Carolina. The case fell apart when the defense claimed Blackwater was keeping the guns for the CIA.
And lastly, you've got Robert Shulman. He's just like a tech billionaire. They make like fingerprint scanners and stuff like that, but he's the director of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, described by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks what it describes as extremist groups. They described the founder, David Horowitz, as the godfather of the anti-Muslim movement. The Freedom Center says it combats the efforts of the radical left and its Islamist allies to destroy American values. He's also on the board of the Friends of the IDF. This network, through their various foundations and think tanks, have their hands in basically the entire right-wing media, peppered throughout other non-specifically right-wing media. And then they've also got this whole big network of like alternate media where you can basically just like lie or like really misrepresent something in the alternate media, and then you can report it on your like actual legitimate media, like your Fox News or your Newsmax, or well, mostly like your Fox News. And you can also misconstrue it on Fox News, but like, you know, a bit more closer to the truth, and just legitimize all the bullshit narratives that are going on in the alt media thing. You see? So they also fund politicians. While Trump was in office, Congress was 50% Koch funded, and they dictate what judges get nominated. Amy Coney Barrett being the prime recent example. And the goal is to basically just privatize and deregulate everything. As well as the alt media, they've got a huge network of grassroots Facebook groups, Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, websites, news outlets, all this stuff that poses as like independent things, and the sock puppet accounts leading the conversations around in their groups, all to sway the public opinion and convince the working class that what they want is the exact opposite of what's in their actual best interest. They do this by producing a multitude of studies and paid academics presenting their opinions from their research foundations and throughout the rest of the network out to their media arms. Most prominently, this has been used to spread doubt about climate change or climate science. This has obviously been going on for a while, and while this stuff certainly happens here, it's not as widespread and popular. I mean, I don't know, really. It's not as widespread as it is in America. And it's, you know, this whole sort of movement and the sort of flip from being a heavily astroturfed to like mobilizing a lot of people, it happened from a few factors. So next to the Heritage Foundation, or maybe more accurately, behind the Heritage Foundation, not directly Koch related, but it was founded by the DeVos family and a bunch of other people. I think initially funded by the DeVos family. And it's currently funded by the Mercers. Robert Mercer is their largest donor. This is something called the Council for National Policy. And this is where the libertarian, pro-fossil fuel, freedom-chasing, deregulation section of the right wing joins up with the elements of the far right. And by that, I'm talking like all elements of the far right, really. It's a jumble of shady characters and nefarious interests. Started by a group of people, including the founder of the Heritage Foundation, members of the John Birch Society, various evangelical leaders, and some far-right billionaires that were literal Nazis or if they don't admit to being Nazis, they were at least definitely friendly with the Nazis, German, and share the same views as them. But that's a whole other episode in itself. CMP's been around for about 40 years. Unlike the Heritage Foundation, which has which is just like PR, getting its name out there all the time. CMP's mostly avoided the spotlight of all news reporting. They don't really speak about the CMP. They've got like that whole Fight Club rules going on, where it's like number one rule of the CMP is you don't talk about the CMP type thing. You're supposed to not admit that you're a member, and you're supposed to deny even knowing that it exists. There's a book that's come out about it recently that's really interesting. I'll just read what SourceWatch has about the Council for National Policy. Council for National Policy is a right-wing, not-profit group that has been described as a little-known club of a few hundred of the most powerful conservatives in the country, and a hyper-secretive Christian right powerhouse that helps set the movement's agenda. The organisation connects the manpower and media of the Christian right with the finances of Western plutocrats and the strategy of right-wing Republican political operatives. The CMP describes itself as a counterweight against liberal domination of the American agenda. Their membership is comprised of leaders in the family values, national defence and decency movements woven by members of the Dead Billionaires Club like the Adolf Cause Foundation, the Koch brothers, Richard DeVos, Richard Scaife and other billionaires and foundations who have invested heavily in developing a complex web of far-right groups, think tanks and politicians over the last 40 years in order to return the United States to its pre-Franklin D. Roosevelt 19th century capitalist roots. Utah Democratic Party Chairman Wayne Hollins said the CMP meeting gives the public a rare opportunity to see, or more accurately not see, what Republicans are all about. And that is how policy is influenced in this country by what amounts to a secret society of far right-wing conservatives and religious extremists. 2016, Southern Poverty Law Center obtained a copy of CMP's 2014 membership directory. They described the group's membership saying the 2014 CMP members are paragons of the conservative establishment. They're business titans, Christian college presidents, owners and editors of right-wing media outlets, GOP megadonors, government staffers and leading members of conservative think tanks. There are officials of organisations like the NRA and the Federalist Society. There are politicians and political appointees, anti-abortion activists, and some who are less known publicly as conservatives. But what is most remarkable about the directory is that it reveals how the CMP has become a key meeting place where ostensibly mainstream conservatives interact with individuals who are, by any reasonable definition, genuinely extremist. Right? Now, I know this is a lot of seemingly obscure information. Those playing along closely at home might already be lining up the parallels in their head. But not only do I find this really interesting, but like it's super relevant. To give you a bit of an idea of its relevance, we saw how Freedom Works, when we read their 2021 report, it said they've had a busy year with COVID lockdowns. Well, through a subsidiary of the Council on National Policy, it's called CMP Action, we can actually zoom in a little bit more on what that means. The shadowy right-wing not-profit is helping coordinate coronavirus response strategy and promoting the lockdown protests. Working alongside close allies that have helped coordinate the protests, including Stephen Moore of the Heritage Foundation and Freedom Works, Council for National Policy Action has been hosting conference calls and publishing action memos around reopening states' economies. CMP Action is the non-profit affiliate of the Council for National Policy, a coalition of far-right political advocacy and think tank figures that has worked largely behind the scenes since its founding in 1981. CMP's membership includes conservative Republicans, right-wing extremists who work together to shape policy, Trump allies including senior advisor Kellyanne Conway and former chief advisor Steve Bannon were CMP members as of 2014. Vice President Mike Pence and Trump's lawyer Jay Sekulow have also been members, according to a recently published book by Ann Nelson. Since last month, CMP Action has hosted weekly conference calls to coordinate coronavirus response tactics. The first call featured Moore, who founded the Committee to Unleash Prosperity, the Heritage Foundation's Ed Meese, and Al Regnery, chairman of CMP's Conservative Action Project and the cousin of prominent white nationalist William Regnery. Moore has called the lockdown protesters the modern-day Rosa Parks for protesting against injustice and loss of liberties. Spammy, mate. The email announces the second call, which featured ALEC CEO Lisa Nelson and State Policy Network CEO Tracy Sharp, links to information about an April 21 car protest at the Alabama Capitol building in Montgomery. Organised by the anti-LGBTQ group Eagle Forum, the forum's founder, the late Phyllis Schlafly, was a CMP member, and several current staffers are part of the CMP-connected Save Our Country task force. The announcement directed the readers to a private Facebook page of the group Reopen PA, which was one of the three groups that organised an April 20 lockdown protest at the Pennsylvania state capitol. The other two groups' Facebook pages have been deactivated. In an announcement of the third call, CMP Action directs allies to send links to op-eds, articles and social media posts to a teapartypatriots.org email address, indicating that the group is involved in CMP's organising efforts. The Save Our Country task force will send it out for others in the coalition to share and cross-promote for a multiplying effect, the announcement said. We need to share the stories of people who have been affected by the lockdowns to show that we must be concerned with both sides of the crisis, states the Tea Party Patriot Action website. Sounds pretty fucking familiar, right? Cutting in live from the editing chair. So I'm just thinking about this, right? So you think back to when COVID first hit. Remember how like the price of fuel like halved? And they were like paying people to take fuel because they couldn't store it. No one was using any fuel because no one was driving because like the whole world was locked down. But it makes sense why the Koch brothers would be funding these worldwide freedom protests, right? Then I thought they should have invested in toilet paper. And while it turns out they own a whole host of toilet paper brands and related products, and they own a large pulping mill. So the CMP and its affiliates have a substantial network of Christian TV and radio. This Christian TV and talkback radio works hand in hand with the pastors at Sunday Mass to promote their chosen candidates and policies. So when you combine that with the media landscape of the Kochtopus, I mean, it's an immense force for this right-wing agenda and extremely influential. So let's have a look at some of the alternative media that's directly funded by the Kochtopus network. This is just sort of like the main ones. The Daily Caller, the Rubin Report, the Washington Free Beacon, the Daily Wire, New American, the Gateway Pundit, Epoch Times, Rebel News, Breitbart, PragerU, Turning Point USA, Turning Point UK, and Project Veritas. And then through these media outlets, you get your personalities, right? So Breitbart was run by Steve Bannon, who was part of the CMP. They have admitted to spreading fake news articles intended to stoke the culture wars. They did a whole host of these anti-Muslim fake news videos. They're responsible for Milo Yiannopoulos. He was the editor before, he made some weird career choices. The funny thing about him is that they just plucked him from nowhere, and he was actually he's basically this stereotype of like a crying liberal. He used to write for this like progressive magazine, and he used to write articles basically calling for the internet to be censored so that people weren't so mean. So Breitbart is owned by Nina Rosenwald and it's funded by the Mercers. The funding also comes from the Middle Eastern Forum, which is a hardline conservative pro-Israel think tank that Nina Rosenwald is part of. And then you've got Rebel News, funded by the Mercers, funded by Robert Shulman and also funded by Nina Rosenwald. Celebrities to have come out, I use celebrities loosely. Personalities to have come out of Rebel News include Tommy Robinson, Laura Loomer, and Lauren Southern. So let's just talk about Lauren Southern for a second. Lauren Southern popularized what's known as the Great Replacement Theory, which is like this conspiracy theory that like ethnics are going to outbreed white people.
Because the thing I want to talk about today is the Great Replacement. The Great Replacement is a term coined by French writer Renaud Camus, referring to what he views as the irreversible overthrow of France and its culture by Muslim immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa.
And I know it sounds ridiculous and it's like easily disproven. It's been around for a while, but she popularized it because she's, you know, this attractive, young, blonde Canadian chick blogging from her bedroom. And she starts talking about this stuff, and it went nuts in like the far right circles. And so Rebel News picked her up, and she was initially just doing like your stereotypical, you know, lame ass RV Yemeni type, you know, gotcha shit. But then she started doing documentaries, right? She did a whole bunch of them. But she made this one documentary about the plight of white South African farmers who were being murdered in South Africa, being persecuted. And the South African government actually released a statement about this, saying it's like not true, and it's been denied from a lot of South Africans as well. But it must have struck a chord with Peter Dutton, because he went and offered refugee status to these white South African farmers, right? You clearly just watched that movie. And, you know, they might sound ridiculous, but fast forward like 1 or 2 years, and Peter Dutton's office approves Lauren Southern's visa to move to Australia, and now she's a presenter on Sky News.
She's been described as alt-right and a white nationalist. She was detained by the Italian Coast Guard and barred from entering the UK and New Zealand. 2016, she authored and self-published Barbarians, How Baby Boomers, Immigrants and Islam Screwed My Generation. Outsiders fans will remember she was on this show when she was touring Australia with Stefan Molyneux. They both suffered from the insidious cancel culture, being denied platforms and even a livelihood because of their views. But now, this morning, Lauren Southern has decided to get back in the saddle and has returned to the spotlight exclusively on Outsiders to be uncancelled. Has she mellowed? Has she changed her views? Lauren Southern, welcome back to Outsiders. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, that's ridiculous in itself. But when you consider that the Great Replacement Theory was the motivation for the Christchurch massacre, and the killer actually wrote a manifesto, and it was called The Great Replacement. And after that, Peter Dutton approved Lauren Southern's visa to move to Australia and become a commentator on Sky News. You can't really say anything about that, but that is fucked. Anyway, there's Gatestone Media that Nina Rosenwald runs. It's also funded by the Mercers, and they make content for Rebel News and Breitbart. They make like fake news videos. And then you have Project Veritas, also cited by Sky News all the time.
I'm going to expose how you are being lied to over and over again by people and organisations that you think you can trust. And I'm also going to have a warning about what we've come to expect as normal could all be about to change. And it's got nothing to do with coronavirus. It's going to have real implications for your finances and your life. Now, we all know that institutions, particularly here in this country, occupy an important place in our society. As such, they're expected to act with integrity and basic decency toward the people that rely on them. Now, broadcast news media once belonged in that category. It was trusted, it was honourable, it was straight up and down the line in reporting the facts. It covered the important stories that we all need to know, and we had confidence in what they were telling us. But slowly, most of them have now dumped hard news in favour of pop culture reporting.
Switch Pro.
An undercover reporter from Project Veritas has captured video footage of CNN directors boasting of manipulating the news to, and I quote, change the world.
Project Veritas is funded by the Mercers and the Koch brothers. It's also funded by the David Horowitz Freedom Center, mostly financed by Robert Shulman, who's on the board of the Friends of the IDF. The point of Project Veritas is to be like a media watch type thing, but for, everything that isn't Fox News or anything in this network. They take little chops of footage and then turn it into this big story about how they're lying to you or whatever. And then they pass that on through just Fox News or even Sky News, and then it becomes news from the front of the culture war. Then you got the Rubin Report, funded by the Koch brothers, as is Dave Rubin. Then you've got the Daily Caller, that's funded by the Koch brothers. It has actual neo-Nazis writing articles. Then you have the Washington Free Beacon, which is funded by the Koch brothers. Then you have the Daily Wire, that's Ben Shapiro's news outlet. It's funded by the Wilkes brothers. They're the fundamentalist fracking family. They also fund PragerU. Ben Shapiro was initially funded by the Koch brothers when he was at Breitbart before he left and Milo Yiannopoulos took over. Then you got Turning Point USA, and you've also got Turning Point UK. That's funded by the Koch brothers and Betsy DeVos. Candace Owens, although she claims to be fiercely independent, she works for Turning Point USA. And then you've got a bunch of other people that are like either part of the think tanks or amplified by the think tanks. And these are people who are into like the podcast space might find a few of these names familiar. You got Jordan Peterson, amplified by the Heritage Foundation. You got Eric Weinstein. He seems to have some kind of affiliation with the Hudson Institute. He's a frequent guest on their podcast, which is hosted by Sega and Jetty. He's also the director of Thiel Capital, which is Peter Thiel's company. Peter Thiel owns Palantir, which is a more powerful database than i360. And there's a whole host of others, but I'm not going to bother covering them because we might be veering off track a bit. But all you got to know is you've got people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson linking up with people like Eric Weinstein and his brother Brett Weinstein, and then eventually these people linking up with Joe Rogan through the cancel culture thing. Jordan Peterson got big for speaking out about some law, but from what I hear, it wasn't even true in the first place, which is weird. Brett Weinstein also rose to fame from a similar controversy. Joe Rogan spoke out about transgenders in sport. These guys all have their own podcasts or do speaking tours and stuff like that. And when they all sort of had their separate controversies, they all linked up into this thing called the intellectual dark web. And this is like your, more sophisticated cultural layer that introduces people who might not really be exposed to those ideas. But then, they're mentioning these same issues that are being run with in all this alt media and leading people to that. I'm not saying these people didn't have legitimate views and, careers and stuff. I'm just saying they were sort of plucked out of the broader ether and amplified. And you could probably, if you really wanted to, you could put the Joe Rogan Experience into the next couple of outlets that I'm going to mention, which are not directly funded by this network, but are key parts of getting the message out. I'm not saying Joe Rogan is aware of this. I'm not saying any of these guys are Koch funded, except for Ben Shapiro. But I'm saying that, well, Jordan Peterson was definitely amplified by them. He works for PragerU, so I mean, technically he is funded by this Koch-puss machine. Eric Weinstein, Hudson Institute, as is Nina Rosenfeld, so I guess he's connected. I don't know if Brett Weinstein's part of it either. Sam Harris was like debating intellectuals about the threat of Islam and was really sort of like anti-Islam, coming out and saying things like Muslims can't integrate in Western countries and like ridiculous shit like that. I don't think Joe Rogan is either, though he does vote libertarian and talk about libertarian things. But I digress. So the actual two organizations that aren't funded but are definitely key parts that both sort of cater to different aspects of the people they're trying, the broader base they're trying to reach, particularly in the Trump campaign, is Fox News. And then there's this article from 2015, right? At least 15 Fox News hosts and contributors have recently campaigned with two political organizations created and funded by Charles and David Koch. Those same personalities have also defended the Kochs from attacks and praised their political efforts on air. The following Fox News personalities have participated in Americans for Prosperity events since 2012. Guy Benson, Tucker Carlson, Monica Crowley, Jonah Goldberg, Greg Gutfeld, Mary Catherine Ham, Mike Huckabee, Laura Ingham, Andrew Napolitano, whatever, Sarah Palin, who I know was also from the CMP, I believe, Charles Payne, Dana Perino, John Stossel, I don't know, I don't watch Fox News, Kel Thomas, and Juan Williams. I kind of brushed over Alex Jones there. There might be some Alex Jones fans being like, what? No, Alex Jones' talking points is basically just the John Birch Society handbook. He's a shill, 100%. For instance, last time he came on the Joe Rogan podcast, which I'm pretty sure is going to be the last time he's on the Joe Rogan podcast, he came in with like a handbook of things to refute climate science. It was like his agenda, his aggressive agenda for the day, right? And instead of playing the clip from the actual podcast, because I find it amusing, we'll listen to this Dr. Grande present his analysis.
After discussing Ghislaine Maxwell and Hunter Biden, we see that Jones said, "I'm not trying to make stuff up." Later, he would say that he was not trying to rant. In both cases, I was thinking, you don't have to try. It seems to come automatically for you. Next, we see how they touch on how the press didn't really cover the peace deals that Trump had negotiated. Throughout the interview, we see similar complaints. They talk about how the media is biased to the left. Jones goes on this whole discussion about carbon dioxide, the carbon conspiracy, and suggests that global warming is good, saying that people need it. Then we see this tangent where both Rogan and Jones speculate on the nature of the universe. This was like Bert and Ernie trying to disarm a bomb.
But like, here he is on a podcast that's not the Joe Rogan podcast, but it's just as cool as the Joe Rogan podcast. It's just a bunch of cool guys sitting around talking about cool things, doing cool stuff.
We just moved to Austin. A bunch of podcasts are moving to Austin. I find it ironic that we're having you on our show before Joe Rogan is having you on his show.
I mean, these SJWs will destroy any organization they're part of, and that's why the left and the Chi-Coms want SJWs in the military and want all this, radical race theory that America sucks and George Washington sucks and white people are bad, to destroy unit cohesion that no foreign army could do.
Jared, have you heard about the radical race theory stuff that's going on in the military right now?
The demasculinization of society, or the pussification of society.
But then you say fuck BLM and people are like, oh, you hate black people. No, I hate Marxism, bitch.
Get rid of capitalism, get rid of your testicles, get rid of your family. Sounds like my enemy.
Yeah, and it's actually happening.
See? Anyway, since 2016 and the 4 years of chaos that ensued, which was the end of it, I guess, you had some new additions to this whole network pop up. Well, not, I guess, like pop up, but sort of just join in the chorus, or turn their contributions to the chorus up full. So you have the Epoch Times, right? Not part of the Koch network. It's run by the Falun Gong, which is a Chinese cult. They're kicked out of China, basically. They spread a lot of this anti-China rhetoric, and it's basically just a ridiculous, fiercely anti-China conspiracy theory laden media outlet. And then you've got Sky News Australia. I don't need to go into any detail about them today because we're going to talk about them heaps in the future. But all you need to know is they've gone off the fucking rails in the last 12 months, completely off the deep end. Also, you've got Parler. Rebecca Mercer sits on the board of directors of Parler. You can sort of see there how that works together to sort of spread, covertly even, spread this information into people's ears and just drill it in. And it's that whole idea of like repetition. You know, if someone hears something enough times, eventually it's going to be accepted as like a valid idea, whatever it is, you know, and that's sort of, I guess, the key to this. So thankfully, we don't have a network that extensive in Australia, but obviously in Australia, a lot of that network is popular. It wasn't just this, though, that led to the US electing Donald Trump. There was another layer to all this, to all the data and all the media and all the plants and all the different places and all the hidden messaging and constant propaganda. And we're going to have to stop it there because we're almost at an hour here. So join in next time. We're going to have a look at the more sinister and below board tactics and methods that have been used that tie all these different aspects together and weaponize them. So like the page, share this, subscribe and all that stuff, and I'll see you fairly soon.